He was the man in the denim jacket and the wire-rimmed glasses, the voice that made an entire country hum along to mountains they'd never climbed. But the John Denver most people carry in their heads is only half the man. The other half wrote his own memoir and put things in it that his fans still have trouble believing actually happened. A chainsaw. A 3-page letter to NASA. A father who broke the sound barrier but couldn't say, "I love you." Here are the true stories behind John Denver, the ones he told on himself, and the ones investigators had to piece together after he was gone. In 1982, after 15 years of marriage, John Denver and his first wife, Annie Martell, were done. According to Denver's own 1994 autobiography, Take Me Home, the breaking point wasn't an affair or a fight over money. It was a stand of shrub oaks outside their Aspen home that Annie had cut down without asking him first. Denver, by his own telling, drove off angry and came back with a chainsaw. He didn't touch the trees. He went into the house and started cutting up their shared furniture, and according to multiple accounts drawn from that same memoir, he ultimately took the saw to the bed the two of them had shared for over a decade, the same bed connected to the marriage that had once inspired one of the most successful love songs of the 1970s. Annie, in later interviews, described genuine fear in that moment, unsure at first what her husband intended. Denver never denied any of it. He wrote about the scene himself, in plain and almost startled detail, as if he were still trying to understand who he'd been that day. It's the kind of story that doesn't fit the image most people have of John Denver, the soft-spoken environmentalist who sang about sunshine and country roads. But it's also not a rumor invented by a tabloid. It's in his own book, in his own words. To understand how the man who wrote Annie's song on a 10-minute chairlift ride became the man swinging a chainsaw through his own bedroom a decade later, you have to go back much further, to a kid who didn't even have the last name Denver yet. He was born Henry John Deutschendorf Jr. on December 31, 1943, in Roswell, New Mexico, 4 years before that particular patch of desert became famous for an entirely different kind of story. His father, Henry Dutch Deutschendorf, was a career Air Force pilot. In January 1961, flying a Convair B-58 Hustler bomber out of Carswell Air Force Base, Dutch set 3 internationally recognized speed records, flying at more than 1,700 kilometers per hour, and was later inducted into the Air Force Hall of Fame for it. He was, by every professional measure, one of the most accomplished military aviators of his generation. He was also, by his son's own account, not an easy man to grow up under. In Take Me Home, Denver described his father as stern and emotionally closed off, a man who simply couldn't show affection to his children. The family moved constantly, following Dutch's postings from base to base, and young Henry became the perpetual new kid, introverted, bookish, wearing thick glasses, and rarely in one school long enough to make lasting friends. The one place that felt stable was his grandmother's farm in Oklahoma, where at around age 11, his other grandmother gave him an old Gibson guitar. It was the first thing in his childhood that didn't get left behind or packed into another moving truck. That instability didn't end when he became an adult. Denver dropped out of an architecture program at Texas Tech, moved to Los Angeles with almost no money, and spent years auditioning for folk groups before catching on with the Chad Mitchell Trio in 1965. That same year, a fellow musician reportedly told him that Deutschendorf would never work on a marquee, so he chose a new surname off a map, the capital of the state he loved most, Colorado. He became John Denver, and in doing so, quietly set aside the very name his father had spent a career making respected inside the Air Force. Before Denver had a single hit of his own, he'd already written one for somebody else. Around 1966, he composed a song originally titled Babe, I Hate to Go, and handed out home recordings of it to friends as Christmas gifts, never expecting much to come of it. His producer, Milt Oken, was also working with the folk trio Peter, Paul, and Mary, and passed the demo along to them. They retitled it Leaving on a Jet Plane, and it became the only #1 single of their career. Denver got a songwriting credit, and comparatively little money, while his own first solo albums for RCA sold poorly, one after another. For a while, it looked like the man who'd reinvented his own name might end up as a footnote in someone else's success. That changed permanently in 1973. The same year his marriage was already showing serious strain. According to accounts corroborated by Annie Martel herself, John left for Switzerland for 6 days during a rocky stretch between them. To her, alone in Aspen, it felt closer to months. She eventually called him, and the two agreed to try again. Weeks later, John went skiing, rode the Aspen Mountain chairlift, and by his own account in Take Me Home, wrote both the melody and lyrics to Annie's song in roughly the 10 minutes it took to reach the top. He skied down, picked up his guitar, and played it for her that same day. The song hit #1 in 2 countries within months. What followed was an extraordinary run: Rocky Mountain High, Sunshine on My Shoulders, Thank God I'm a Country Boy, and Calypso, written for the research vessel of his friend, oceanographer Jacques Cousteau. Denver was named Poet Laureate of Colorado, performed at the White House, and co-starred with George Burns in the 1977 film Oh, God. By any outside measure, he was one of the biggest recording artists in the world. Annie later described the very song that saved their marriage as something that, over the years, felt less like a gift she still had and more like a wish she kept repeating. Denver himself admitted in his memoir to repeated infidelity during those years, and by the late 1970s he was rarely home. The marriage that Annie's song was written to save limped along for nearly another decade before it ended in the chainsaw incident already described. By the time that marriage was over, Denver was already chasing something even bigger than fame: a seat on the space shuttle. By the early 1980s, Denver wasn't just a musician with a guitar and a friendly smile. He sat on the board of the National Space Society and was involved in advocacy for what NASA called its Citizen Observer, or Space Flight Participant Program, an effort to eventually send an ordinary civilian into orbit alongside trained astronauts. Denver wanted that seat badly. According to the outlet Mental Floss, he wrote NASA a 3-page letter making his case, later saying he'd have gladly traded his guitar for a few days in space. By his own account, he believed for a time that he had a genuine shot at being the first civilian to fly. In August 1984, President Ronald Reagan announced that the honor would instead go to a schoolteacher, selected through NASA's Teacher in Space project. From roughly 11,000 applicants, the agency eventually settled on Sharon Christa McAuliffe, a high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, officially confirmed as the primary candidate in July 1985. On the morning of January 28, 1986, McAuliffe and 6 NASA astronauts boarded the Space Shuttle Challenger. 73 seconds after launch, the spacecraft broke apart. All 7 aboard were killed. Denver had been considered, and passed over, for a flight opportunity built around that exact program. In the aftermath, he didn't distance himself from what had happened. He leaned into it. He wrote and recorded a tribute song called Fly For Me, dedicated to the fallen crew, and organized a benefit concert that raised $50,000 for the astronauts' families. Years later, reflecting on the loss, Denver said plainly that in a sense he felt responsible for Christa being on that flight, and that he would have gladly traded places with her even knowing how it ended. It's one of the more striking, lesser-known admissions of his career, and it didn't stop him from pursuing space entirely. Denver reportedly went on to explore the possibility of flying to the Soviet-era Mir space station as a paying civilian, a plan that would have required him to learn Russian and train near Moscow for roughly a year. It never materialized. He never made it to space. But he never really stopped wanting to. Back on Earth, Denver's personal life took another sharp turn. In 1985, while touring Australia, he met a much younger singer named Cassandra Delaney. The two married in 1988 on a mountaintop above Aspen. The following year, their daughter, Belle, was born. A biological child that came as a genuine surprise, since Denver had long believed himself unable to father children after complications during his first marriage. It was, by most accounts, a real and unexpected joy inside a relationship that was otherwise falling apart. Delaney later described a marriage marked by heavy drinking and volatility, and in his own memoir, Denver didn't paint himself as blameless either, writing candidly that the relationship had made a fool of him more than once. The couple separated in 1991 and divorced in 1993, following a custody dispute that reportedly cost the two of them a combined total in the millions of dollars in legal fees. Delaney was ultimately granted primary custody of their daughter. The same period brought Denver into repeated trouble behind the wheel. He was arrested for driving under the influence around the time his second marriage ended, and arrested again in August 1994 after crashing his Porsche into a tree near Aspen. By October 1995, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered him to stop drinking entirely if he wanted to keep flying. When the agency later determined he hadn't complied, it revoked his medical certification outright in 1996, stripping him, at least on paper, of the legal right to pilot an aircraft. Less than 2 years later, he bought a new plane anyway. On September 27, 1997, Denver purchased an amateur-built experimental aircraft called a Long Easy from a previous owner who had flown it for years. The plane had originally been assembled from a kit, with modifications made along the way by the person who built it, modifications that would turn out to matter a great deal. On October 11, the day before the crash, Denver flew the aircraft for the first time on a roughly 30-minute orientation flight. During that flight, according to the National Transportation Safety Board's later report, he and a mechanic discovered a serious design flaw: the fuel selector valve, the handle a pilot uses to switch between fuel tanks in flight, had been installed behind the pilot's left shoulder instead of in its normal position, reachable from the front. The technician who checked Denver out on the aircraft told investigators he personally disliked the placement so much that he'd never used the selector in flight at all. The two men reportedly tried extending the valve's handle using a pair of pliers the day before the crash. It still wasn't easy to reach. On the afternoon of October 12, 1997, that same mechanic offered to top off the plane's fuel before Denver took off from the Monterey Peninsula in California. Denver declined, saying the flight would only last about an hour. He took off just after 5 p.m., practiced several touch-and-go landings that burned through additional fuel, and then headed out over open water. According to the NTSB's public findings from January 1999, the right fuel tank ran dry only a few minutes into the flight. To switch tanks, Denver had to twist around in his seat to reach the valve behind his shoulder, and investigators concluded that as he turned, he likely applied unintentional pressure to the right rudder pedal. The aircraft yawed sharply and pitched upward before entering a dive. Witnesses on the shore near Pacific Grove, California, watched the plane spin and go down into Monterey Bay. Some, at first, assumed they were watching some kind of stunt rather than a real emergency. Toxicology results later came back completely clean. No alcohol, no drugs of any kind, despite the years of legal trouble that had preceded that day. Denver was 53 years old. He had logged more than 2,700 flight hours across a career that included ratings in single-engine, multi-engine, glider, and instrument flying, along with a type rating on his own Learjet. None of that experience mattered once the fuel ran out on the wrong side of an unfamiliar plane with the valve in the wrong place. Colorado's governor ordered flags lowered to half-staff. Thousands gathered for an outdoor memorial in Aspen, and his ashes were later scattered across the Rocky Mountains he'd spent a career singing about. Months after his death, Denver won the only competitive Grammy Award of his career, Best Musical Album for Children, for a record he'd made the summer before the crash, an honor he never lived to hear announced. Colorado would go on to name Rocky Mountain High one of its 2 official state songs and induct him as the first member of the Colorado Music Hall of Fame. West Virginia adopted Take Me Home, Country Roads, as one of its 4 state anthems, a song about a state its songwriters had reportedly never set foot in. Across his career, Denver sold more than 33 million records and wrote roughly 200 of the nearly 300 songs he recorded. None of that, not the chainsaw, not the 3-page astronaut letter, not the father who finally learned to talk to his son from inside a cockpit, tends to show up in the version of John Denver most people remember. The public image was gentle and uncomplicated: flannel shirts, acoustic guitars, sunshine on his shoulders. The private record, in his own words and in the findings of federal investigators, describes someone considerably more restless, a man who spent his whole life reaching for something just out of frame, whether that was his father's approval, a seat on a spacecraft, or a fuel valve mounted 18 inches behind where it should have been. Which version was the real John Denver? The man who wrote a love song in 10 minutes on a chairlift, or the man who, years later, took a chainsaw to the bed where he once sang it to her? Most likely, uncomfortably, he was both. John Denver's autobiography Take Me Home, an autobiography, 1994, NTSB Public Meeting Report on the October 12, 1997 crash of N